Well, the bell was about to ring, and I had a big choice to make, to go to practice or not to go to practice. I was a freshman in high school, sitting down in the cafeteria for lunch with my classmate Dan, sitting across these long cafeteria benches that were white and speckled. I don't know if that was common back in the day, but we were just there, both of us, commiserating, feeling relieved. The junior varsity for football had just wrapped up their last game the night before, and there were no playoffs for us. That was for the varsity, so there was one thing on both Dan and I's mind, and that was, we're done. We were in the sacred space of finally all the year of work and preparation with football practice was coming to a close. We were expressing our relief to one another when all of a sudden somebody barged into our conversation and said, "No, we still have practice, Coach said." What? Dan didn't flinch. He said immediately, "I'm not going." And as for me, my heart, it just sank. It was not an easy year. It was not an easy experience for me. There wasn't, especially for that first year in football, there wasn't a lot of joy in it for me. So after the bell rang that day, well, I didn't go to the locker room. Instead, I walked my way home. But every step that I took, I had this kind of sick feeling in me that grew. I felt a little rebellious. It felt maybe a little defiant, but mostly it just felt out of sync. Like something in me knew that this isn't the place that I'm supposed to be. Now, maybe not all of you have had the wonderful experience of skipping a football practice, but you've had that feeling, that sense inside of you that you're off course. And maybe it wasn't an open act of rebellion or defiance or something dramatic, but maybe for you it was more of a slow drift. Maybe you thought work was done. The pressure has passed. I am finally free. Or maybe you found yourself pulled to a different kind of space. Maybe it was some kind of a sidetrack, or you were unexpectedly caught by something that you couldn't foresee. Maybe you hit a wall, and it was just too much, whatever it was you were going through. It was too heavy. You were looking for an escape hatch. You thought, I just can't get out. And every part of yourself in that moment was just saying, flee. Get out of there. Whether you struggled with confusion in that moment, or whether you were chasing something or running after something else, perhaps you were thinking the same thing. I don't even know how I got here. And maybe behind that there was something deeper like this. I don't know if God even wants me to be here, or if I just kind of wandered into this space. Well, over the past 3 weeks, we have been exploring in our new series called Questions God Asks. Some of the most interesting, sometimes provocative questions that God brings up throughout the scriptures. Questions like, where are you? Or questions like, what is your name? And it turns out that those kind of questions aren't necessarily questions that God gives to shame us, but sometimes questions to draw us closer, or sometimes questions to reveal something to us about us that we didn't know, and bring some light to a particular calling that we have. But what do we do when we have a sense of where we are and a sense of who we are in God, but still find ourselves going the wrong way? If that's something that you've asked yourself, and if that's an answer that you don't personally know, here's the danger to that. We can start making peace with misalignment. We can stop expecting movement in our lives. We can learn to function while being spiritually frozen. We keep showing up, but we stop checking in. We keep praying, but we stop listening. We keep moving, but stop asking, am I even still on the path? And here's what's scary. We can end up building a whole life in a place God never called us to settle. We can raise a family, build a ministry, spend decades of faithfulness, all while quietly believing the best part of our stories are something that are behind us. The best part is something that is behind us. And if you've ever had that feeling of where you are isn't where you're supposed to be, this question, it really matters more than you think. How do we make sense, or how do we make anything of where we have ended up? Well, we aren't the first to ask a question like that, and I think that's exactly where we find one of the most powerful prophets in all of the Bible. If you've grown up thinking of prophets as kind of these ancient holy men with beards who were kind of weird, maybe like an uncle who always would whisper conspiracy theories in your ear during Thanksgiving dinner or something like that, well, fair enough. But Elijah is different. He didn't come from a prophetic school. He had no priestly name. He shows up out of nowhere like a mysterious figure coming out of the desert at just the right time. I think he's a little bit more like Obi-Wan Kenobi than a well-dressed preacher. He steps out and he turns heads, not with parables, not so much with teaching, but with miracles. He calls down droughts. He raises a boy from the dead. And he does so much more. And in a culture spinning towards idolatry, Elijah, he stood like a rock. Now his enemies, they weren't street level either. Ahab was a king of compromise during that day. And his wife, Jezebel, she was a queen who didn't just flirt with Baal worship, with idolatry. She made it a national policy, killing prophets who practiced otherwise. Elijah faced them down, not with political alliance, not with a whisper campaign, but literally with fire coming down from heaven. He was bold, he was defiant, and here's the thing, he won. Which is why what happens next is so unbelievable. Let's read this. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. And he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It's enough now, O Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." And he lay down and he slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and he drank, and then he lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. Well, this is a heavy moment in the story, and chances are for some of you it lands especially hard because chances are many of you know what it feels like. You have been there before. You know what it feels like to be done, to feel empty inside, to feel like you just have nothing left. And if that's you, it's remarkable how this story meets us with so much compassion. God doesn't rush. He doesn't shame. But before we rush into the message, I want to name something else that's quietly unsettling about this passage. Because as true as it is that this struggle that Elijah had can also be very true of us, it's not just that somebody broke down, it's who broke down that also matters for our understanding of what's going on. Elijah, the pillar, the prophet, the miracle man, it was him. When someone like that shatters, it shakes us deep within, because whether we like to admit it or not, we hold these people as pillars in our lives, not just as examples, but as anchors for us. When this happens to someone who is unshakable, we can't help but ask ourselves inside, if it can happen to them, where does it leave me? And this is why this story, it leaves us with such a gift. When Elijah is undone, when he lays under that broom tree and says, I've had enough, God doesn't rebuke him. Instead, he sends an angel. He doesn't preach. He doesn't correct. He doesn't even remind him of all of the miracles. He just says, get up and eat. And did you notice this? On the second time, the angel reaches out and he touches him. Touches him. God meets Elijah not with fire and fury, but food, gentleness, touch. That's where the healing starts, not with a lecture, but with presence. And maybe that's a word that some of you here need today too. Because when we hit a wall, or when we watch somebody that we love or somebody that we look up to hit a wall, the voices in our head, they can get to be really loud. How did I end up like this? Why can't I just push through? Or why didn't I see this coming? And then after that, the shame kind of comes in, makes a home in our hearts. But not God's voice. He always approaches with care. God's way is different. And yet, in this story, in this strange story that we find ourselves in, even in the midst of the care, the food, the provision, the gentleness, the touch, even amidst all of that, there's a deeper question that remains. What happened that brought Elijah to this space in the first place? Why did the servant of the Lord want to give up? So let's read on and find out a little bit more. There he came to the cave and lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, have thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And God said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But The Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. The sound of a low whisper. Chances are some of you are very familiar with the phrase, still small voice. And there's good reason for that, and maybe you heard a little bit of that in that last verse, because that's a classic translation of what we just read, that low whisper. And let's be honest, that really means something to us. Over the past few weeks, some of you have shared how you experienced maybe the voice of God in this subtle prompting way in your heart to maybe give you a new name or to reaffirm something important about you in a difficult time. Or maybe you experienced some encouragement by that inner prompting, or even just reading your Bibles, you've found life and something personal for you based upon what you've been going through. Sometimes for you it's been just a ray of sunshine that has broken through the clouds at the perfect time, saying that he hears you, he sees you, he loves you. And I believe that God works like that. I do. But here's the thing. That may not be exactly what's going on in this moment. And it's important to know that, because it's important to understand that, because what the whisper meant for Elijah, because we might unlock what's going on in us too. Let's take a moment before we dig a little bit deeper and zoom out in the story. Elijah is coming from the wildest high in his ministry. He brought down a drought on the land, and he experiences this face-off with 400 prophets of Baal. There is a public showdown on Mount Carmel. And then fire from heaven, literal fire from heaven, comes down. It was a moment, it was a grand finale, it was a turning point. It was the moment when Israel was supposed to wake up and turn and go back to God. Everything was supposed to be made right, and it didn't. Jezebel doubles down. Elijah goes from fire caller to fugitive. And suddenly everything that he knows about how God moves feels broken for him. And this is why the whisper matters. Because when Elijah goes to the mountain again, the same place where God met Moses, actually, he sees all the signs that he might expect, or that we might expect. He sees big things like a wind that moves rocks. He sees an earthquake. He sees a fire, and these are all signs of power in Scripture. That last one, fire, that would have really brought him back to that moment on the mountain where fire literally came down. But this time, God isn't in any of those. They're there, but he's not in them. That's what it says. Instead, a thin silence. That's maybe a way to translate that expression from the Hebrew a little bit more closely. A breath. It's not said directly, but it's suggested clearly enough. This time, in that thin silence, that's where God is at. What's happening here is not just poetic. It's transformative. Because the God of Elijah, this is important, the God of Elijah was the God of the fire just a few moments earlier. But now he's teaching him that the God of Elijah is also the God of the quiet, also the God of the small, the God of the seemingly mundane, the God of unseen presence, the God of slow work. And that can be really disorienting, because God didn't change, Elijah didn't change, but Elijah had to learn to know God in a new way. Something that caught my attention this summer while reading a book called How to Know a Person by David Brooks was a discussion he had about how to know your spouse and what kind of happens over time when in your marriages, what tends to happen is we kind of stop asking questions. We settle in because we create this bank of knowledge about our spouses, about the people that we love, and we just like, well, I know that. I know what her favorite color is. I know what she likes to eat. I know what makes her tick or him tick. You know all of these things. That's just as true with our kids or our close friends. It's kind of true in all of our relationships. And I want to say that there is something to kind of being able to, as you grow older in life, and you grow older in life together, to be able to enjoy this quiet, steady presence with one another. But this was the challenge, and it really challenged me. David Brooks said, but your spouse changes. And when we stop being curious to your spouse or your children, then we stop really learning about who they are. And we may not be comfortable with that idea that people change, but the truth is we all change. We all experience change. We only stop figuring a person out when we think we have them figured out. And the same is true of faith. Not because God changes, but because God reveals himself. Sometimes in little pieces, and sometimes a layer at a time. When he moves in ways that we don't expect, it can feel like he is abandoning us. But maybe it's not absence at all. Maybe it's actually God moving closer than you expected, just not in the way that you imagined. So, when God asks Elijah, what are you doing here? He's not scolding. He's not shaming. He's saying, Elijah, this part of me, you never knew it. But I've been here the whole time, and I still have something for you. That sounds like an invitation to me. It sounds like a chance for us to change, to see bigger, and we'll get there shortly. And you think that this would be a turning point in Elijah's story. Things would be different. He would finally see what God is trying to communicate through a little food, a whisper. Elijah would see differently, but here's the surprise. He doesn't. He doesn't see it in this moment. The question, that same question is repeated by God, but Elijah says the exact same thing in return, almost word for word. Look at what he says. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, I can imagine him taking a deep breath. I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away. A while back, I had the chance to sit down with a friend who has been for some time experienced what I would call a deep grief. Not in the sense of like a kind of vague, philosophical grief, but just painful, concrete, life-altering grief because of something that happened to him that was outside of his control. And in the moment where we sat down, I could just feel it from him. Everything in his life was colored by the pain that he had experienced. He saw everything through it. And I was a little bit struck, to be honest, not because of how big his pain was, but because it reminded me of a time in my life, or maybe multiple times, when pain was so big it was hard to see anything else or think about much else. It just kind of clouded my vision. Now, maybe some of you are familiar with the famous C.S. Lewis quote, where he describes pain as sometimes being God's megaphone, God's way of grabbing our attention and seizing us when nothing else seems to be communicating to us. And sometimes that's true, but But I also wonder if it's always true. I wonder if there are some times in our life when pain is so big that it clouds what we are able to see. It clouds what we are able to hear. And maybe that's what was happening to Elijah in this moment. He was so disoriented. He was so disappointed. His expectations were so shattered that in this pain he couldn't see the subtle and quiet thing that God was trying to communicate to him in that moment. Perhaps that was happening to Elijah. And I think this is why it's important that this is recorded for us. And it's because it's important to be reminded that the best time to prepare for disorientation is before it comes. And we can look at these heroes of Scripture. We can see the models of bravery and courage that they are in the midst of the big moments when the fire comes down. But here also we have a lesson for us that even they couldn't hear what God was asking at times to prepare our hearts for whatever might come our way. Elijah had every reason to be disoriented. He was chasing something good, revival, restoration, a moment where God would turn everything around and everything would start to click again. But now, after the fire, he is hiding, and he is just repeating the same tired lines over and over because nothing has turned out the way that he thought. And maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you were a part of a marriage that didn't last, or a role that you didn't choose, a diagnosis that you didn't ask for. So, maybe you also feel burned out. You are suffering from the shame of that experience, or you just simply got tired. And maybe, like Elijah, you quietly concluded that God can't possibly be in this place. Maybe you never said it, maybe you never thought it, but maybe at least that's an idea that you felt. God can't possibly be in the place of this disappointment, this boredom, or this fog. But what if he is? And what if that's the whole point of the question? What are you doing here? Not a rebuke, but a reminder that you're still his. He's still yours, and he has still something for you to do. That's what the whisper means. That's what the meal means. That's what the touch means. It's God saying, let's get back to what I made you for. It's not what you expected, but it is what I have entrusted you for in this moment. Because healing isn't about escape, as tempting as that can be. It's not about finding something else for us to chase. It's about being regrounded in who we are, who God is, and what he has for us. A couple of years ago, I became a Penn State fan. Maybe not in the sense that you think. I won't be watching any of their football games this fall, and I won't be rooting for them when they beat my team. But I learned something about them that really inspired me. It's about their chant. We are Penn State. It's not that old as the history of college football goes. It apparently started in the 80s. Other teams had great chants. Penn State didn't have one, so they started with a chant where tens of thousands of people during a football game would say, "We are Penn State." You heard it? Are you familiar with it? We are Penn State. Well, back in 1948, they won a bid, I guess you call it a bid, they won a bid to play in the Cotton Bowl. And this is where this expression comes from. And they were going to play against a team from the segregated South. But at the time, that team told them, hey, we're not going to play you unless you decide not to bring the two black players that are on your team. And so, as a team, they congregated, they got together, and they decided not to go. And at one point, a reporter came up to one of the captains on the team and asked them to explain their decision. And he answered with 4 words: "We are Penn State." Translation: this is who we are, and who we are determines what we will and will not do. Well, if you're wondering what happened to our good old friend Elijah, God sent him back. God said to him, "Go. Go and anoint Hazael, anoint Jehu, anoint Elijah." And then, almost to address Elijah's lonely script, he added, "I still have 7,000 people that have not bowed to Baal." Translation: you're not as alone as you think, and you're not done yet. Because God still had something for Elijah, and he still has something for you. When we root ourselves in what God has called us to do, not in how we thought it would go, but in what he's called us to do, we find the courage to keep going when everything just feels off in our lives. We can stand back up after a fall. We can stay in it when it would be just easier to bail. We can stop running, not because the road got easier, but because we remembered who we are and most importantly, whose we are. Because although plans break and pressures mount and we lose track of how we got here, God is not going anywhere. Even when we end up where he didn't send us, God still has something for us. Maybe for you, your wilderness wasn't a broom tree, but it was a waiting room. A breakup. Or a job that feels like it just slowly hollowed you out over time. And maybe you sensed that the fire faded and you didn't notice until it got loud. You tried, you prayed, you trusted, you stayed, and still the story didn't play out how you thought it would play out or how it was supposed to play out. So now you find yourself sitting in a place that you never thought you would be sitting. You're sitting in this place that you never expected, wondering, did I miss out? Did I mess up? Did I drift too far to go back? And maybe you wouldn't say it out loud, but deep down inside, you're not sure whether God can still use you. Not after the failure, not after you've been burned, or not after the detail, not from here, not from this place, surely. But let's be honest, this is not just your story, it's our story. We all take detours. We all have these moments when exhaustion takes over, when clarity runs out, when we've looked around and wondered, how did I get here? And sometimes the drift can be really slow in our lives. It's not just rebellion, it's sometimes just resignation. Sometimes the burnout is dressed as bravery, and sometimes the pain plays on a loop in our lives, and we can't stop but hearing anything but that. And in those moments when passion cools, when prayer dries up, when mountaintops, when they feel like those mountaintops feel like they're another person's story, we assume silence means that we're done, or that God's done with us. But this story from Elijah, it reminds us that silence is not absence. Confusion, it isn't disqualification. The God of fire is the God who called Elijah out of the cave. And the God of miracles is also the God of meals, the God who sends, and the God who stays. And when he does, and what he does is he doesn't just point us to the past, he points us to the path, saying, you're not as alone as you think, and I am not done with you yet. So we go back. not to what we have planned, not to what we have pictured, but to what still matters. We go back. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. Because our calling isn't over, because the cave didn't cancel the mission. We stop chasing the mountaintop and start trusting in him and the road ahead. Why? Because even when we end up where he didn't send us, even when we end up in that place, he still has something for us. So maybe today for you isn't about starting over. Maybe it's just about you saying yes to him again. Yes to a God who still calls. Yes to a God who still speaks. Yes to a God who still sends, wherever you're at. Because maybe he's intent on changing the mouth of a cave into a runway for what he has next. Let's pray.